Juneteenth is observed every 19th of June to mark the day in 1865 where Black Americans in Texas finally realized they were free after 2 years of emancipation was declared. It stands as a powerful symbol of delayed freedom, resilience, and the enduring fight for justice. Now in Ghana, this powerful event was demonstrated through a stage play. They honored this Juneteenth celebration through a stage play in Ghana. Let's watch the video. Now, this was staged at the historic Cape Coast Castle, and it was in honor of the Americans, of the Africans that were shipped to America, to the European borders for slavery. They were shipped from Ghana. So we are talking about where our ancestors were sold from. Our ancestors were sold from Ghana. Most of them were sold from this slave trade in Ghana. And that's what we're going to be talking about. Ghana thought about honoring these ancestors, these Africans that were sold to America. And so they're called African Americans. So Ghana thought it wise to celebrate them. Well, so many people said it's not a good representation of the ancestors, of what they went through, because it is a slap on their face. It's an insult. I mean, you sold them in Ghana and right now you're celebrating. Say you're celebrating them by staging a play when they were sold in Ghana. Well, this has been the argument back and forth, but family, Ghana did stage a play and the president was there too. Let's watch the video.
Give me back my children now! I say give me back my future today!
Do they not know who you are? Surely they must know that you were not fashioned to be any man's slave. Surely they must understand that you come from a stock of warrior women who will not be tamed by any man. Tall Ayanda, strong Ayanda, beautiful Ayanda, please come back to us, your people, fellow humans. Did we not welcome you as special guests?
Now, family, it's important to note that this play was staged in a dungeon, in a slave castle, where Africans were previously kept. Yes, you heard that right. In the 1800s, Africans were kept in these dungeons. At first, what was kept in these castles were gold. Unfortunately, it happened that Africans became slaves and they were kept in this castle. And there was a door of no return, that when you pass through that door, you're either being shipped to America or to any European country because they needed slaves in their countries. It's a long story, family, so Ghana chose to honor them, but so many people aren't happy about it because it is not a good representation of our people. Well, they said, you guys sold them, so why celebrate them?
The enactment of the slave trade that Ghana did on Juneteenth was an inappropriate way to observe Juneteenth. This is why Black Americans be saying they don't want the diaspora celebrating Black American holidays, because y'all don't be doing the appropriate things. You don't even understand the holidays that you are celebrating. Juneteenth is a holiday about freedom. It's about the day that the last of the slaves got freed in Texas, even though slavery had been abolished since January 1st.
And these castles we're talking, we have different slave castles in Ghana. We're going to talk about it. These different slave castles, family. Do you know that one of them had a church on it? A slave castle, a dungeon was underneath, and then a church was on it. They built a church on this slave castle to sound righteous, to seem righteous. I mean, on that same altar where they knelt to praise God, to pray to God, they kept slaves underneath. And that's why sometimes we wonder who these people serve, because how can you claim to be a Christian and then subject your fellow human through this torture? Now let's talk about this whole story, family. But first, let's watch this video.
This is Christian's Ball Castle here in Osu, Accra. On top of this castle was a church, while underneath it was a slave dungeon. So while captives were underneath this castle crying for help, being raped, tortured, and killed, The masters who captured them were upstairs praising their God for job well done. You get to the point now. Listen, before you teach your children religion, make sure you teach them history first. You get to the point now. You cannot truly know your God if you don't understand your history.
Now, there is this one castle that carries the symbol of heartbreaking transatlantic slave trade stories. I mean, the history of how our ancestors fought, because we're talking about Africans that were sold to America, how they fought in this castle. It's called the Elmina Castle, originally built by Portuguese in 1482. This castle wasn't built for slaves, but it ended up housing so many Africans that were later shipped to Europe or America. Now, it was built by the Portuguese in 1482 as a trading post for gold and ivory, but when the demand for labor increased, Americans needed more labor, America needed more labor, Europe needed more labor. So what did they do? Instead of putting gold in that warehouse, in that castle, instead of putting ivory in that castle, they resorted to putting humans in that castle. And then there is this thing they called a door of no return. Humans are kept in that castle with no food, little or no, what's it called now, windows. And then when it's time for them to ship them, there is this door called a door of no return. They are shipped, and then that's it. Their life is over. They are on their way to America or any European country where they are needed. Now, between the 1482 family and 1786, European powers erected fortified trading posts spanning nearly 500 kilometers along the coast of Ghana, now from Keta in the east to Beyin in the west. These structures were erected by the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, Danish, Swedish, German, and British. The first and the most infamous of them, like we said earlier, was the Elmina Castle, which was built in 1482. And within a few decades, family, these castles were converted to prison for enslaved Africans before they were shipped across the Atlantic. And the sad thing about this family is that these windowless dungeons would hold up to 1,000 individuals at a time. No way of escape, nothing for them to do. I mean, all the things they wanted to do was in that castle. Now imagine how many people were unalived due to this. They were in that dark, airless chambers with no light, no sanitation, no dignity. They slept on stone floors, covered in the filth of those who came before them. Now, after this set of slaves leave, another set of slaves would be put in that prison. No sanitation whatsoever. So death was a common thing then. And the most chilling detail of all is that above the women's dungeon, the Europeans built a chapel of worship. Family. So they claim to love God, worship God, love the people. But underneath a chapel of worship was a dungeon, the women's dungeon. While the cries of enslaved women echoed through the floorboards beneath their feet, they went on to raise up holy hands. I wouldn't call that holy hands actually. Bloody hands in worship of Jesus. Through that small dark archway, the captives were marched in chains down the water edges. They were loaded into ships and sent across the Atlantic Ocean, never to see their relatives, mother, father, children, or homeland again. Now, it's estimated that 13 million Africans were forced into slavery before the transatlantic slave trade was largely abolished in the first half of the 19th century. Family, we're talking about 13 million souls, 13 million Africans. And maybe it could be over 13 million actually. Now, that same route brought goods to West African coast, slaves to America, raw materials to Europe. So imagine the kind of ship our ancestors, were put in. Just take a minute to imagine. Now, in all this, we would actually blame our African leaders then because they were in need for what they could get. Goods were coming to Africa. Labor was being shipped to America, to the European countries. We had corrupt leaders. It didn't start today. And they were so corrupt that they would see that mothers, fathers, children were treated like trash. And for over 150 years, Ghana was the center of slave trade. Yes, you heard that right. Ghana, for over 150 years on Africa's west coast, Ghana was the center of British slave trade. And then we had Kemi Badenoch, who talked about Britain not getting involved in slave trade. Oh yeah, they were involved. They were largely involved. Now, the Gold Coast wasn't a stop. It was the engine room where slaves were shipped to America, where slaves were shipped to Europe, where, materials were brought. Ghana was there for over 150 years. So we're talking about where our ancestors were sold from. This is where they were sold from. This is where it started. Different slave castles of the Portuguese, of the Spanish, of the British. Now, they all had their own castles. So the British had their own castles, the Portuguese had their own castles filled with slaves. And Ghana was the hub of this. So yeah, remember they launched their year of return for all Africans. You want to come back to Africa, come back to Ghana, and thereon, you could find your ancestry. Ghana, it's safe to say that Ghana owes African Americans a lot. Not just Ghana, the leaders, Africa in general. Now, family, I'm just going to list some of the castles, the slave castles we have in Ghana. We have the Elmina Castle that was built by the Portuguese in 1482. We have the Cape Coast Castle that was built by the Swedish in 1653. And then we have the Christiansborg Castle, built by Danes and later became Ghana's presidential palace after independence. They even had the balls, the effrontery to make that place their castle after independence, after everything that happened. They should have felt a level of shame with what they did. But anyways, can a staged play really, really depict what our ancestors went through? How they were beaten, starved, malnourished, how they were treated like trash, and then shipped to land they knew nothing about, separated from their families and friends. Well, Ghana was the hub for over 150 years. It was the engine room where slaves were shipped. And then to crown it all, they built a chapel as though to atone for their sins while they were still committing those treacherous sins. So family, what do you have to say about this story? This is where it all began, where our ancestors were sold. They were sold from here. This slave trade castles in Ghana. And then in celebration of the Juneteenth, they staged this. But it can never compare to what our ancestors really passed through, the Africans who left their lives. Some fought for their lives, fought for independence where they found themselves. And yeah, so we have it. And there we have it, family. Comment what you think about the story. And do not forget to share, like, subscribe, and turn on your notification button. My name is Lynient Akotonou.